In this video, I'm going to show you how to adapt and customize one of CDS's duplicate identification services. The scenario that we're going to follow is about a fictional company who are a payroll provider. They're called Paid, and they provide outsourced payroll services for other companies. Now, each person, each individual that they have to pay is set up in their database as a contact, in their system as a contact. And it's the contacts, the individuals that they need to pay, who they want to deduplicate. Now, there's a snag, however, which is that the same individual could easily work for two or more of Paid's clients, because the same person can be employed by different companies. And if that's the case, those aren't duplicates as far as Paid are concerned, because they have to provide two pay packets if the same person is working for two different companies. It's only if the same person is working for the same company that they have a duplicate on their hands. Now, this means that they're going to have to not only take into account whether the individual's details are the same, their name, their date of birth, their address, and all the other pieces of information that we use to find duplicates, but they're also going to have to take into account whether the company name that they work for is the same, or whether the company they work for is the same more generally. So to achieve that, we're going to have to adapt one of the matching services. Now, what are we going to have to do? Well, we'll have to change the match rules, because at the moment the match rules don't take into account whether an individual works for the same company or not. So we're going to have to make changes to the match rules. But we're also going to have to adapt the interfaces, the data interfaces and the web services around matching. And the reason for that is that we need to bring in a new attribute. Now, there is an attribute in the data interface called individual candidates. That's the data interface name. There is an attribute in that individual candidates data interface already called account name, and we can use that to pass through the name of the company that each individual works for. But the problem with that is that it's not a very reliable field in Paid's system. It's a free text field and it's got unreliable data in. And so as well as passing that in, they want to pass in an account ID, which is a numeric field, and it's a very reliable field because it's a primary key and they trust it. It holds unique data. But in our individual candidates data interface, there is no attribute to hold the account ID. So we're going to have to create a new attribute and also make a change to the web service to pass that attribute in, as well as changing the match rules to look at that attribute and take into account when we find duplicates. So again, let's just reiterate the basic issue here that we're trying to solve is if we have the same person working for the same company, that is a duplicate. If we have the same person, same name, same address, same date of birth, but they work for different companies, that is not a duplicate as far as our scenario is concerned. So let's look at how we're going to adapt the matching service to deal with that. So we want to adapt one of our duplicate identification services to deal with finding duplicates based upon not just the individual's name and address and date of birth, but also their company ID. So how are we going to do that? Well, a good place to start is by looking at the jobs within CDS. So here's the EDQ CDS project. Let's open it up and let's look at the jobs node. And within the jobs node, we have a batch individual match job and we have a real-time individual match job. Now, if we wanted to identify duplicate individuals in both batch and real-time, we'd have to adapt both jobs. But we'll just stick with the real-time individual match job as an example during this video. So let's open that job and let's try and get a sense for what's happening within the job. So the job has one phase called individual match. But within that one phase, there are actually 8 linked processes. Now each process is denoted by the 3 yellow balls joined together. So you can see the 8 processes going down here. What do they do? Well, just to get a sense of it, we're starting with inputting the data in this process here, and then we're standardizing the data in these 2 processes. Then we're doing some clustering. Going further down, we're preparing the data here. In this process, this is where we actually do the matching. So this is the process where the matching happens, called match individuals. We'll look at that later. But then after that, we prepare the results from matching, and finally in our last process, we output the results. So we have 8 linked processes. Now, how are they linked? Well, they're linked using data interfaces. And there are also data interfaces for input into the first process and output into the last process. Now, the symbol for the data interface, the icon, you can see here. So you can see each of these processes has a data interface on the left for input and on the right for output. So what data interfaces are used? Well, for input into the very first process, we're using a data interface called individual candidates. And for output from that process, we're using a different data interface called combined data preparation. And we're actually using that combined data preparation interface for the input and the output for most of the subsequent processes. You can see it in all of these, and moving down also here as well, and for the input into the match individuals process where the matching actually happens. After that, things change a little bit. So the output from the match individuals process uses a data interface called internal match results. That's also the input and output for the match results prepare process, and it's the input for the match results output process as well. But the final data interface in the job, in that match results output process, is called individual match. Okay. So we've got a number of different data interfaces being used, and we're going to have to adapt each of them to include an extra attribute called account ID. All right. In fact, actually, we'll only go as far as match individuals because we don't want to output the account ID. So we won't have to adapt the final few data interfaces, but up to this point, we'll have to adapt each of them. Okay, and in fact, that really means 2 because we've got the combined data interface, data preparation data interface, which is used throughout, apart from the input to the very first process, which is individual candidates. So really just 2 data interfaces we need to adapt. But we'll also have to adapt each process as well. So when we add a new attribute to a data interface, that's all well and good, but we need to make sure that the attribute is populated at the outset of each process, so it's read into each process, and that it's populated when we write out of each process as well. So the reader and the writer of each process must populate that attribute. So just adding the attribute isn't enough. We need to go into each process and make sure it's actually populated, so it's coming in and out. There's a value coming in and out of each process in the chain as well. Now finally, data interfaces, I hope you remember, are really attribute templates, and they need to be mapped at the outset of each job. They need to be mapped to a real source of data. And now that could be staged data, but because this is a real-time job, it's actually going to be mapped to a web service. So as well as adding the attribute to the data interface, we also need to add it to the web service, in this case, that it's mapped to. And if we were dealing with output, there'll also be a web service used for output that we'd need to adapt as well, but we're not doing that in this scenario. So we're going to need to add an attribute to 2 data interfaces, and we're going to need to add an attribute to a web service as well. We're going to have to go into each process and make sure that that new attribute is populated in each process and output from each process. And then once we've done all that, we can actually go into the match individuals process here, and that's where the match processor will be, and then we'll need to adapt the match processor's rules to use our account ID attribute that we've added. Okay, so that's the little challenge that we have, and next we'll look at how we're going to go about doing that. Okay, well, let's get our ducks in a row by adapting the data interfaces and also the web service first of all. So the first data interface for input there is called individual candidates, and let's go and find that. So in the project browser, we'll go up to the data interfaces node and open it up, and there is the individual candidates data interface. So let's open it, double click it, and we need to add a new attribute. You can see the attributes that are here already, by the way. They're the kind of things you'd expect: first name, last name, date of birth, various details like mobile phone numbers and email addresses, and national insurance or tax numbers, and address details, etc. Now we do have here, as I think I may have mentioned, an account name attribute. So we can pass through the free text account name that this individual works for, is employed by and is paid by, if you like. But we said that's unreliable, it's a free text field. So what we need is an account ID field, which is going to contain this reliable primary key, which is a number. So we're going to need to create a new attribute for that. So let's do that in this individual candidates data interface. And to do it very simply, we just click the plus button here and we type a name for the attribute. So I'll call it act ID, like that. And this is where we put in the data type. So we'll make it a number. And we'll just move it to the bottom of the data interface so we know where it is and we can find it easily. So that's done. We've added a new attribute to that individual candidates data interface. Now, we said that is mapped to a web service, and it's mapped using this real-time individual match mapping. So we can have a look at that mapping, right click on the data interface and go to mappings, and there it is, real-time individual match. That's the name of the mapping, and there is the name of the web service it's mapped to, individual match. Okay, so let's find that web service. We'll go down to the web services node. So here is the individual match web service, and we're going to need to create a new attribute there as well for the account ID. So let's do that. Very similar to creating a new attribute for the data interface itself. It doesn't have to be called the same thing, but probably helpful if it is. So that's done. So there's our new attribute for input for the web service. We don't need any new attributes for output. We're not going to change the output. So that's fine, that's done. Now, the data interface and the web service are linked together via the mapping that we just looked at. So we're going to need to adapt that mapping too. So let's do that. So let's go into individual candidates there, right click it, mappings. And here is the real-time individual match mapping. And if we double click that, we can see the mapping. And let's go down to the bottom. On the left, we have the web service attributes. On the right, we have the data interface attributes. And at the bottom of each, you can see the new account ID attribute we've added. And we just need to map it from one to the other. So that's saying, take the value in the account ID attribute from the web service and pass it through to the account ID attribute in the data interface. That's all that mapping is doing. Very simple. Let's finish that. So that's done. Now, that takes care of the incoming web service and the individual candidates data interface that it's mapped to. But after that, we have the combined data preparation data interface. Okay, and that is taking the data all the way through our job, all the way to the match individuals process here. So we also need to add the account ID attribute to that data interface too. So let's do that now. Here on the left, here it is, combined data preparation. Let's double click it. And again, here we're going to need to add a new attribute, which we'll call act ID. And remember, it's going to be a number, isn't it? So done. So in a way, that's kind of put all of our ducks in a row. We've got all of our new attributes set up for our web service and for the two data interfaces, and we've done the mapping between the web service and the initial data interface. Now what we need to do is to make sure that our processes are actually reading in and writing out a value for that new attribute. Otherwise, the attribute will be available, but it won't be populated. So, that's not a lot of use. So we need to go into each process now, okay, in our job, up to the match individuals process, and we need to make sure that we're actually populating that new account ID attribute. So let's start with input prepare here, right click it and open it, and it'll open in the process canvas. And here's the reader, and let's very simply make sure that we're going to read in that account ID. At the moment you can see it's not selected. Let's select it, and now it is. So that's read into the very first process. Great. But we also need to make sure we write it out. There's the writer at the other end, writing to the combined data preparation data interface. And at the bottom of that data interface, we have the account ID attribute that we added. And over here on the left in the available attributes, it should be sitting there as well. There we go. Let's select it for writing, and let's just map it, hook it up to the account ID attribute in the data interface. Okay, so done. So now in the first process, we have the account ID being populated by the reader for input, and we also have it being written out by the writer as well. So let's just save that, and we can close that process now. So that's the first process taken care of. Now we need to do the same thing in the other processes going as far as the match individuals process. So let's go into the next one, standardize address, and let's open it. We're just going to do the same thing basically. There's the reader. Let's make sure that we select account ID for this process. Done. Okay, good. And there's the writer. And again, let's just make sure that we take that account ID attribute there, and we select it for writing like that. There it is. And we actually do map it as well. Okay, so it's going out via the data interface as well as in. That's the second process done. Save it, close it. Okay, and now let's do the third process. So we're just going to go through and do these processes. Standardize individuals. Again, let's open it. Let's let that open for a second. Thinking hard. There's the data preparation interface. Let's bring in account ID. Done. And at the other end, we should find a writer. There's the writer. And again, let's select account ID for writing. And let's make sure that it's mapped through to the right field. There we go. So that one's done. Save that. And we'll close that. Okay, it's a big process, I think, so that's why it's taking a little while to think there. So next one in the line is the cluster real-time process. Let's open it. Again, exactly the same thing. Reader. Let's make sure we're reading it in. Account ID, there we go. Done. And the writer. Let's select it for writing. There we are. And let's write that out or map it across. Done. Save that. And nearly there. Match prepare real time. Let's open that one. And again, two readers, two writers here, and we have to make sure we pass this through in both. So one will deal with what's called the driving record, and the other will deal with the candidates. So if you like, you think of that as the original record and the ones to be compared to. It's the easiest way to think of it. Anyway, we need to deal with both. So let's make sure we read it in this reader and also in this reader. 2. There we go. And let's make sure that we write it out as well in both of the writers. Let's do that now. So that's one writer done. Let's do the other writer. 2. So we're just making sure this comes through everywhere. Okay, good. Close that one up then. And that should take us now to the last process that we need to be concerned with, which is match individuals. So all we want to do is get this account ID as far as match individuals, not further than that, because we don't want to output it, but we do want to use it for our matching. So let's open that one. And let's just, again, we've got 2 readers here. We need to make sure that they're both reading in account ID. There it is on the first one. Let's select it. Just make sure that's there. Yep, good. And let's do the second one as well. Okay, that's there. Great. And we'll save that too. So that should have made sure that the account ID is now being populated and passed through each of our processes in our job as far as the match individuals process, which is the last one where we need it. So the next thing we're going to do in just a minute is have a look at the match individuals processor and have a look at how we can change our match rules to use that new account ID attribute. Before we do that, let me just mention that we haven't done any preparation to it. Okay, we're going to just assume it's okay. Obviously, it might be that you want to not just pass it in and out, but also adapt one of your processes to prepare it somewhat before. I won't do that, but I'm sure you can think about how you might be able to do it. So next we'll look at adapting the match rules to use the account ID attribute. Let's look at adapting our match rules then. So we're still inside the match individuals process, and we can see the match individuals processor, which is the match processor, and it's accepting input from 2 readers, one called working data reader and the other reference data reader. These are the readers that we adapted to make sure we were reading in a value for our account ID earlier. Now, one of them will read in the driving records and the other one will read in the candidate records to matching. Okay. Now let's go into the match processor itself, and we need to make sure that the match processor inputs the account ID. So let's double click on the input subprocessor, and there are the driving records. That's the driving record stream in this tab, and the candidate records are in this tab. So we need to make sure for both of these that we're actually inputting the account ID, and there it is. For the driving records, it's not yet selected, so obviously we need to select it, and now it is selected. For driving records, let's do the same. For the candidate records, let's go down and find it. It's not already selected, so we'll select it, and now it's there. So we've read in the account ID into the match processor for both the driving and the candidate records. Good so far. Now what we want to do is to compare the account ID between records, isn't it? Is it the same or not? And to create comparisons, we need to first have an identifier that links together the account ID and the driving and candidate records. So let's go into the identify subprocessor. Again, we won't have an identifier for account ID yet. We need to create one. Let's click the little plus to do that. So we'll call this identifier account ID, and remember that the attribute is a number, so we'll make the type number. There we go. Now we need to map it to the account ID or the act ID field in the driving and candidate records, and we can just do that very simply, just like this. So there is our account ID identifier mapped to the act ID attributes in the driving and candidate records. Let's click OK. And let's next go to the match subprocessor, so the business end of matching really now. And we'll start by taking a look at the match rules. Now, in this processor, there are a lot of match rules, and they're divided into groups. So let's take a look at one of those groups, this name exact group. And this has a number of match rules within it. You can see them here. And for each rule, the name must be exactly the same, hence the name of the group, name exact. But the first rule is looking at whether the name is exactly the same, plus the date of birth and email are the same or similar. The next one's looking at the name being exactly the same and the address and the email. The next one is looking at the name, obviously, but also the email and phone number. This one's looking at the name and the company and the address. Remember, the company name isn't reliable in our data, which is why we need account ID, and so on. And if I just take a look at the next group down, standardized given name, it's very similar. Again, it has very similar rules in, except this time we're looking at a standardized form of the given name, so William instead of Bill, for example, plus other factors in each rule. Now, remember what we want to achieve. We want to make sure that the account ID is the same for any records which we're going to identify as duplicates. Now, one way to do that would be to change each of these rules in each of the groups so that they also look at a comparison on the account ID. That would be one way to do it, but we'd have to make a lot of changes to a lot of rules. We'd have to add a new comparison looking at account ID for each of these rules, and we'd have to do it in each of these groups as well, and there's a lot of groups. So that would be one way to do things, but another way would be to turn the issue on its head and say, well, yeah, we can say the account ID must be the same for records to be duplicates. But we could also say, if the account ID is not the same, records cannot be duplicates. And that means creating an elimination rule, which we put near the top of our list of rules. So that's probably what we'll do. But to do any rules at all, we first need a comparison. So let's go back to the comparisons tab. Let's find our new account ID identifier. There it is. Let's add a comparison for it. Now, we're going to choose equals, so we're looking for an exact match. We'll call this account ID exact. And we're assuming that the account ID holds reliable data. It's a primary key, so hopefully that would be the case. In reality, we probably want to do some profiling and some investigation to make sure it is the case, but let's just assume it for now. So we won't do any fuzzy matching on the account ID. We're just looking at, is it exactly the same? One comparison, account ID exact. So we've got our new comparison. Great. Now we can go to the match rules tab. Now let's create a group. The first group at the top, and these groups fire in order, okay, is called eliminate matches between candidate records. So no two candidates can match. Only a candidate can only match with a driving record. That's the purpose of that. Let's create a new group, and we'll call our new group eliminate if account ID is different. There we go. And we'll move it so it's second from top of our list of groups. So it will fire the rules within this. In fact, there will only be one rule, but they'll fire second after the rules in this eliminate matches between candidates. The very next thing we'll do is we'll look at the account ID is different. And if it is, we won't go any further, and none of the other match rules will fire, so it will never be a match. Let's create a rule then. So let's call this account ID different. The decision will be no match, and we just find our new comparison at the bottom here, account ID exact. That has to be false. So if the account ID is not the same, then the decision is no match. And remember, that rule is firing really close to the top of our list of rules, just after the elimination if we're dealing with two candidate records. So in fact, we could probably even put it right to the top, but we won't do that. So what that means is that we're actually eliminating any pairs of records where the account ID is not the same. And if the account ID is not the same, we're not even considering whether they're a match based upon any other factors. And that means that the account ID must be the same in order to find a match. That should be the result of this logic. Let's click OK. And we can save this process and close it. And we'll close the job as well. And in a moment, I'll fire up the real-time duplicates identification for individuals, and we'll go to the web service tester and we'll see if it's working. Okay, so we want to see if our changes to real-time duplicate identification have worked. So the first thing we need to do is to go to the server console, and let's just connect. It looks like it's not connected to the server at the moment, so we'll just connect it up. And now what we can do is we can run the real-time process. So we'll go into CDS, EDQ CDS, and actually we're going to start this real-time start all job here. And it will take a little while to fire up, but let me just get it started, or at least get it beginning to go for us. There we go. And if we go to current tasks, in a moment we'll see it pop up. Now it has to do some preparation first, so I'll stop recording now and I'll start again when the real-time services are running, and then we can test our real-time individual duplicate identification and see if our changes have worked. So back in a few moments' time. So the real-time services have started. You can see in the server console, here's the real-time individual match service running. So let's go to the Launchpad. Let's start or call up the web service tester there, and we're going to test our changes now. So we'll select the EDQ CDS project, we'll select the individual match service, and we'll call that service. And on the left we'll have our inputs, on the right we'll see the outputs. So let's match some records together. And in record 1, candidate we're putting 0. Candidate 0 means that it's the driving record actually. And what I'm going to do is put in some of my own details here. So just go a little bit further down. There we are. And first name I'll put in Peter. Last name Webster. And a little bit further down I'll also put in my email address. There we go. And finally, at the bottom of the fields for input, in record 1, you will see our new field, Act ID, Account ID. So it's there. That's great. Let's put in a value of 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's our first record, the driving record. Let's add a record that we want to match that one against then. And in our second record, actually, we're going to put in exactly the same details because we want to find a match. So here is record 2. Record 1's just above it there. Candidate 1. So this is a candidate record that we want to match against record 0, the driving record. And we'll put in exactly the same information. First name, Peter. Last name, Webster. And then further down, we wanted the email address, don't we? So let's just find the email address. There it is. And then finally, at the bottom again, we'll find our new field, Account ID, Act ID, and we'll put in the same value, 1, 2, 3, 4. So we've got exactly the same information in the two records that we're going to match. Let's go to the top and let's hit send. There we go. And we should see the results here. And there they've just arrived. So we found a match. Match score 96, which is a strong match. In CDS, the match scores are on a scale between 0 and 100, with 100 being high. So 96 is a strong match. And we've matched on the name exactly and the email address. So that's great. We found a match. We found a match because all of the details, including the account ID, are exactly the same. Now, let's test the change that we made. So the change that we made to matching was that we've introduced this new account ID field, and if the account ID is different in the two records, even if everything else is exactly the same, the two records cannot match. So in the first record, candidate 0, let's change the account ID to 5678. So now we have a discrepancy in the account ID. It's 5678 in the first record, and in record 2, we'll just take a quick look at the bottom of record 2. You'll see the account ID is still 1234. So now we have a different account ID, even though all of the other details are still the same. Now when we hit send, we should see different results. So let's hit send now. And on the right, you can see no results returned. That means no match was found. Why was no match found? Because the account IDs are different. And that's exactly the outcome that we wanted to achieve. So our changes have worked. So that was an example of changing an EDQ CDS service, one of the duplicate identification services. And just to remind you, we changed the interfaces to put our new attribute in account ID. We changed each of the data interfaces that we needed to change. We changed the web service that was bringing the data in, which is actually what we're looking at here. We changed the mapping between the web service and the data interfaces. We made sure those data interfaces were populated in each process within the job up to the point of matching. And then once we'd done that, we could actually adapt our matching processor to use our new attribute. So there we go. That's how you can go about customizing and tailoring a CDS service.